Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, it's the postgame pod. The Timberwolves were absolutely dominated by Karl-Anthony Towns, the New York Knicks, and Cats returned to Target Center on Thursday night. We'll talk about what happened. We also have to do a vibe check. What does this mean overall for the Wolves team? Can we overreact to this one? I'm afraid that the answer might be yes. We'll break it all down next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend, the weekend before Christmas. And the Timberwolves are getting their brief pre-holiday homestand off to a horrible start. The Wolves were beat by the Knicks on Thursday night by, what was the final, 27 points, 26 points. It was not actually that close. We'll talk a bit about why that is. Talk a little bit of X's and O's, a little bit of basketball. What happened between the first and second quarters that completely tanked the Wolves? But I think we have to start with the vibes around the team and just like what happened on Thursday night. And is this one of those rare games? Like, if you're regular listener to this podcast, I do not overreact. I think it's very easy to take one game or a 5-game stretch or whatever over the course of an 82-game season and overreact. I think what normally I would consider an overreaction is a proper reaction to this game. And I'll talk about what I mean by that here in a moment. And then we'll get into some of the other stuff about the game itself today on the show. A big thank you, though, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. And a quick reminder about the Locked On Wolves daily newsletter. You can sign up at lockedondaily.com to get that in your inbox every day, Monday through Friday. All right. So the Timberwolves, the first quarter of this game, and I do want to get into this, but real quick, just to kind of set it up. If you missed the game, this is one of those. I hosted the postcast last night, the live postcast with Jack Borman, and Jack said a couple of times, this is one of those games where if you look at the box score, you might think that wasn't great, but you had to really watch the game to understand how bad it was. And so I want to talk about that. The Wolves, the first quarter was competitive, and we'll talk about what went right. We'll talk about some of the adjustments that were made. We'll do that in the next segment here. The second quarter is when things went completely off the rails. The Wolves are outscored 41-18 in the second quarter. And Naz Reid's foul trouble late in the first quarter was part of it. The way that the rotation had to line up in the second quarter was part of it. That was what started pushing the snowball toward the top of the hill. And as soon as Karl-Anthony Towns found his footing, he was a little rocky in his first stint, had like 3-4 first quarter turnovers. But he got his rest at the end of the first quarter, came back in the second. Actually, I'll say this. I think it started with the last possession of the first quarter with the Wolves up 3. Julius Randle gets blitzed on basically right out by the timeline, loses the basketball, and the Knicks get an easy bucket going the other way with 0.4 left on the clock to make it a 1-point Wolves lead at the end of the first quarter. That's when the vibe started to shift. To that point, it looked like, hey, this was supposed to be Cat's revenge game, which is a weird term for somebody who the fans love him and he loves the fans and the whole thing. And he says all the right things about loving his teammates and coaches for Minnesota. It was more of a, we could call it a revenge game because it's his former team that just traded him, right? Even if there's no real animosity there. It looked like, hey, Julius Randle's going to get his revenge. Julius got off to a good start, was scoring, was passing the ball well, et cetera, in the first quarter. And then that happened, and things completely shifted. After that point, it felt like nothing Julius Randle did was correct. And that may be a little dramatic, but that's what it felt like. That was the vibe at Target Center. Was Julius is going to force another shot. Cat's going to make a like the right decision every time on the other end of the floor. And I said this to Jack, like on the postcast. Yes, their games are very different. They essentially Randle plays the same position in Minnesota that Cat did at least the last year and a half, 2 years. There are some similarities in their game, but they have different on-court games. But their off-court or even on-court, let's call it on-court demeanor. They're not their basketball skill set, but the way they carry themselves on the court, the way they interact with teammates and coaches, the way that they come across to fans could not be more polar opposite. Karl-Anthony Towns was at times, dare I say, cheesy. He would overdo it. He was gregarious. He was demonstrative. He was good or bad. You knew exactly what Cat was thinking. And there was always some sort of expression on his face. There was always some sort of, he wore his emotion on his sleeve. There's so many cliches we could use to describe the way that Cat was in Minnesota. Julius Randle's not that way at all. Julius is a lot more like Jaden McDaniels with his attitude. Or I shouldn't say his attitude, with his facial expressions, the way he carries himself. And then you couple that with this sudden perceived, I shouldn't say sudden either, this perceived unwillingness to pass. I mean, there were a couple of instances in this game where Randle had opportunities to pass the ball to the corners for wide open threes, and he just put his head down and went to the rim to, very little success. And it's those two things happening on the same night as the backdrop to a 26-point loss that was well over 30 points for a decent chunk of the second half. Like if the Wolves had, barely won and, Randle had played the way he played, there'd be less of a conversation. Or if it was a close game and they barely lost, same thing. But with Randle to take 17 shots, lead the team in shots, have 5 turnovers, lead the team in turnovers, and for Cat to drop a 30-26 performance in 38 minutes and shoot 10 of 12, knock down all 5 of his threes, and bury the Timberwolves before halftime, that makes the other stuff, the intangibles, the ancillary things, that makes those stand out even more. And that turns into a bigger picture conversation about where this Timberwolves team stands now 26 games into the season. I've been preaching patience. I've been preaching the sky is not falling, but I thought Jack made an astute point on the postcast last night. And again, if you missed it, it's the audio episode in the audio feed. It's the episode before this. If you're on YouTube, you can hop over to the audio feed or hop over to Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. And it was live on there last night. Jack made the point, this isn't like any other loss. You can't just brush it off because of all the things I just noted, because of the way that they lost, because of who beat them and the way that the opposing team and the opposing player in Karl-Anthony Towns beat them. I mean, Jack, who is usually fairly measured too, said, look, this makes you wonder about this game, makes you wonder about, is there a real chance that Julius Randle's traded? I mean, the trade deadline is only like 6-7 weeks away now. Remember, it's early February now. It's before the All-Star break. Does this hasten a potential trade? I mean, they're 14-12. They're in the play-in right now in the West. Like, they're not below 500, but they're nowhere near where they were last year on it when they were on a 56. They won 56 games and finished third in the West and were in first most of the season. Do you pull the shoot now? And I made the point toward the end of the show last night, like, that's why this is such a tightrope to walk, because in the first place, Tim Conley knew if things go well, you still got to figure it out at the end of the year. You either got to trade him or extend him or let him walk, or like he's got the player option, Randle does. If it doesn't go well, do you preach patience? Do you say, hey, we're still going to win 45 to 50 games and make the playoffs and we'll see what happens? Or do you pull the shoot and reset midseason? Because pulling the shoot right before the season, which is, usually that's a derogatory term. So I'll say upsetting the apple cart before the season on the eve of training camp, that didn't work from an on-court perspective. And I know the move was financial. I don't want to get into it now. I actually kind of want to use this as a soapbox to talk about how much I hated the Cat trade in the first place, but I'm not going to do that because I wasn't the only one, first of all, and I would much rather the trade have worked. I was hoping I was wrong, but this is everything at once. The rare time where I think it's okay to look at, is what normally would be an overreaction to a single game the proper reaction? Is this a true vibe nightmare for the Wolves And the fact that Cat did this to them at Target Center and Randle got booed for most of the night and had 5 turnovers and had his teammates slumping their shoulders and, kind of like the Alexander Walker, I don't want to call it a tantrum because I don't think he was wrong, but he was, I would say, demonstrative in how annoyed he was with Julius Randle at one point when he got ignored in the right corner and Julius drove into a crowd and ultimately did get to the free throw line, but it wasn't the right basketball play. We can't ignore that. And for that to all happen on one night means that questioning the vibe check for the season and is Randle going to be traded sooner rather than later, that's completely reasonable. I don't think it's an overreaction. And when you're in a rough and tumble Western Conference where every win matters, there's not a whole lot of a margin for error. Now, they're not going to trade him today. That would be selling low, wouldn't it? Tim Connolly's not going to let himself be completely backed into a corner, but it's getting there. And the schedule's tough. We talked about this earlier in the week on the show. The next few weeks are tough. They play like only the best teams in the NBA. They don't play one of the league's worst teams until like January 8th or 10th or something. They've got to get this thing figured out quickly. Even if they trade Randle, I mean, it's feasible they could go, 4-6 in their next 10 or worse. And now you're talking 500 or slightly worse or just slightly better. If they go 4-6 in their next 10, they'll be at 500. Like they'll be 18-18. Now what do? It's not too late, I guess, but then you're forced to make a choice on Julius Randle sooner rather than later. There's plenty more time for that big picture conversation. We'll do it actually next week. Not exactly the sunniest Christmas week conversation, but we'll hit it next week. I do want to talk a little bit about what happened in the second quarter of this game between the first and second. We'll hit studs and duds. We'll do all that here on the show today, coming up next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings. Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. You can make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks. Again, it's the absolute best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You can now win up to 1,000, not just 100, but 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Pick more or less on anything. The Wolves play the Warriors on Saturday. You could take, the Warriors were awful. We'll talk about this. I'll hit on it at the end of the show. The Warriors were awful. They got blown out by like 40, I think, against the Grizzlies on Thursday night. Steph Curry was 0 from 3, but if you think he'll make more than 3 or 4 threes, call it, against the Wolves, I think that's probably pretty safe to say. A bounce back game for Steph, if you think that's on the horizon, or if you think Ant will have more than 24 points, or whatever the number is at Prize Picks, that's probably reasonable too, to expect him to maybe have a bounce back. You can check that out over at Prize Picks. They also now offer a MasterCard for quick and easy deposits into your account this sports season. Join now. This holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free picks in December. They're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Picksmas. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download today, use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Today's episode is also brought to us by Rocket RX. Today's episode is brought to you by Rocket RX. If you're ready to boost your confidence and take control in the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Complete a quick 100% online consultation, and you could get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes 2 minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. All right, so what happened here? Let's talk a little bit of X's and O's. The Timberwolves played well to start the game. It was actually super competitive, and I wouldn't even say like the defense wasn't outstanding. Like the Knicks still scored 32 in the first quarter, but it was good enough. The Knicks made some tough shots. Cat was obviously on one early, mostly like he turned the ball over quite a bit. I would say the Wolves defense, the activity and the energy level were actually really good. Chris Finch said after the game, the Knicks beat us in every facet. I would say that's true for the final three quarters. The first quarter, the Knicks had turnover issues that allowed the Wolves to get a lot more shots up. Jaden McDaniels got off to a good start offensively. Julius Randle scored a lot early. Both Julius and Cat were clearly like, this was their moment, and they both scored, and they both had turnovers, and they both had assists, and like the ball was just in their hands a lot. And again, the energy overall was really good. The Wolves had Rudy Gobert guarding Precious Achiuwa. He was starting in place of Josh Hart, who missed the game for personal reasons. And they had Julius Randle on Karl-Anthony Towns, which is the same strategy the Wolves have used against certain bigs in the past, certainly last year with Cat on the team against Jokic in the playoffs. Obviously, that worked great. And in the regular season, Cat's always been great against Jokic. And they've done it this year, too. In fact, when they played Denver early in November, same idea. Put Randle on the scoring big, the stretch big, whoever it might be, and allow Rudy to guard the least threatening offensive player and roam off of him and protect the paint. And that worked early. They turned Cat over a couple of times. And the other thing they were doing is if Cat got basically below the free throw line, they were bringing a double. And as we know, if you double Cat, if he makes quick decisions, he'll be great. You can't really slow him down. If he either goes before the double comes or he passes right when the double comes, Cat is pretty unstoppable. Early, he waited on some of those decisions. The Wolves had a couple steals. I think actually Rudy had 2 steals himself, just kind of lurking and just stepping into the passing lane and knocking away a poor Cat pass. And then the Wolves went into their, they actually only like 6.5, 7 minutes into the game, they took Rudy out, put Naz in. Naz gets 3 quick fouls, and it messes up the Wolves' rotation entirely. So early second quarter, they don't have any offense on the floor. No Julius Randle, no Anthony Edwards on the floor, and the Wolves can't score. The Knicks start a run that eventually balloons into like 26-2, I think, in the second quarter. And it was all started because of, I'll call it the Naz foul trouble. But then when the Wolves brought everybody back in to try and like, hey, we got to bring starters back in. So I think it was like starters plus Dante in place of Jaden, I think. But then the defense was back to, for some reason, Rudy was guarding Cat, and Julius Randle was guarding Achiuwa. It was not guarding Cat, and Cat beat Rudy one-on-one, which that's not a complete indictment on Rudy Gobert. I should say also, Rudy did not play well in this game. But just like when Rudy struggled to guard Jokic one-on-one last year, we're talking about one of the very best offensive players in the entire world. I know Rudy's the best defensive player, but Rudy's impact, it doesn't make him not like Shaq would lose it. Shaq does lose his mind over this, and even in Barkley and those guys. Rudy Gobert is not the defensive player of the year because he's the best one-on-one defender against every type of player. That's not the definition of the defensive player of the year, right? The defensive player of the year is the player that makes the biggest defensive impact for his team on the floor. Because otherwise, like, we could argue all day about who's actually, the best one-on-one defender. Like, that's a different thing. So it's no shame for Karl-Anthony Towns. I mean, dude makes a 30-footer over a 7-1 Rudy Gobert. Fine. I shouldn't say fine. Rudy didn't close out far enough. But like that sort of thing, and some of the other shots, like some of the shots Jokic made against Gobert, it's not like Gobert's playing bad defense. These dudes are just all-world offensive players. Rudy's true impact is when he can be the help defender, and he can guard too because he's so long and because he has anticipation and because, when he plays really hard, which I didn't feel like happened in this game, he can guard too. He can stunt at somebody driving and recover to knock a lob away from the big that he's supposed to be guarding. And again, that's kind of what we saw early in this game. But as soon as Rudy started guarding Cat one-on-one, the Wolves couldn't stop Cat. They just couldn't. Towns is phenomenal. And Randle, for his part, if he's not guarding, it's a lot like Anthony Edwards, although the best case of it, the best version of Randle defensively is not the same as the best version of Ant, but it's similar. Where if you put Ant or Randle off the ball, not guarding somebody who's a high usage superstar type player, their attention wanes a little bit. Their energy level wanes a little bit. And that's obviously, it's not acceptable. They're your 2 stars. But that's, Randle does it. Plus he looks like he doesn't want to be there, which is even worse than what Ant does. And he's just not providing as much. And so this was an indictment on the strategy. First on Naz's foul trouble, because they were silly fouls, put his team behind the 8 ball. And then on Finch, in terms of the rotation, you got to have Ant or Randle on the court to start the second. I know Randle was having turnover issues. I know he'd played a lot in the first quarter because of the Nas foul trouble, but you can't roll out a lineup with neither one of those guys on the floor against a team with an offense like the Knicks. You're not going to be able to slow him down. And unless you really think suddenly Dante DiVincenzo or Mike Conley is going to score a bunch of points for you at the start of the second, you got to have one of those guys on the floor. And then it's an indictment on the strategy to have Rudy go back to guarding Cat one-on-one and not, play the second quarter how you started the game. And then it's also an indictment on how Rudy guarded Cat, how Randle defended. And then on the other end of the floor, we'll get into this in a minute, but a really, I'll call him lackadaisical Anthony Edwards in this game. You could say the same about Rudy. You could say, Randle got a lot of shots up, so it's not like he wasn't there, and he wasn't passive. I'll just call it a haphazard Julius Randle, whereas Edwards and Gobert were passive / lackadaisical. Conley was not good. Jaden was good to start. Across the board, this was on everybody. The players didn't play well. The coaches didn't coach well. And it was all kind of set in motion by the Nas foul trouble, the Julius turnover at the end of the first quarter, the way that the lineup looked and the way that they defended to come out in the early second quarter. It was just over. Third quarter didn't matter. Fourth quarter was almost entirely garbage time. Really, really frustrating for Minnesota. I do want to hit studs and duds. We talked a lot about some individual players, but I want to hit a couple more notes on that. We'll do that here next to close the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. There's not a line yet on Wolves Warriors for Saturday, which is just tomorrow night. It's a little surprising. Tonight, you've got a couple of big lines. You got the Sixers at home, 10.5-point favorites over the Hornets. Philly's obviously playing a lot better lately. The NBA Cup champion Milwaukee Bucks are 9-point underdogs on the road to Cleveland. And then OKC at Miami is interesting. Miami is actually only a 1-point underdog in this game. Looking ahead to the NFL, there's 2 games on Saturday. The Chiefs favored by 3.5 at home against the Texans. Of course, Mahomes banged up, but expected to play. I kind of still like the Chiefs. Take the minus 3.5 there with the Chiefs. Ravens at home for the Steelers minus 6.5. That feels about right. I'd probably stay away from that one. So lots of good sports this weekend leading into Christmas. Check it all out at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, let's close this thing out with a little bit of individual studs and duds. So we've established that there really weren't any studs in this game for Minnesota. There weren't. I know Randle at first glance is he got 24. Nobody else had more than 17. He didn't play well outside of the first few minutes of the first quarter. And even then, he was forcing things. Ant had 17 points on 16 shots. He did have 7 assists, but I think passive is the best word to describe how he looked in this game. He had the one whirling dervish, fantastic spin move, mid first quarter. That was great. Led to a Knicks timeout. That was the high moment, I think, in the game for the Wolves. I think 2 of his 3 threes were when the Wolves were trying to get it from 30 to 20 in the second half. Not a good game for Ant. DiVincenzo, 15 points on 9 shots, 3 made threes. That looks nice. Well, no, he played. Most of that comes in garbage time in the fourth quarter of this game when they left him on the floor with the third unit guys to try and find some sort of a rhythm. That's where a lot of Dante's scoring came from. I think the only guy I would say played well, taking out garbage time. Minot had 11 points in 11 minutes. He knocked down a 3, had 3 steals, was active, continued to make the case for, hey, you guys should play me. I think it would be Nickeil. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker was fine. But again, nobody played great for the Wolves. And Jack made the point on the postcast, the Wolves have to stop putting so much on the shoulders of Dante, Nickeil, Naz Reid. And to this point in the season, I still would argue Nickeil Alexander-Walker, pound for pound, based on what his role is expected to be, has been the Timberwolves' best player. He's shown the most growth and improvement since last year and has not just delivered on what his role is, but over-delivered based on his role. I'm not saying he's a better player than Anthony Edwards, okay? Don't hear that. Hear that based on what his role is supposed to be, he's over-delivering. Anthony Edwards, he's basically done what expected. Some shortcomings, maybe not quite as good as he's supposed to be. I would say the same about Julius. I would say the same about Rudy. Say the same about Conley. A lot of guys that are at or below where they're expected to be. Nickeil Alexander-Walker's been phenomenal overall this season. In this game, he had 12 points on a perfect 5 of 5 shooting, knocked out his only 3-point attempt, and it came at a moment when there was still some doubt. The Wolves were down by a lot, but it was a significant moment. As far as significant moments can be, as much as they can exist in a 26-point loss. But I thought Nickeil's activity was good. He had 3 rebounds and assists to steal. Was his typical self. Nobody else gets a stud in this game. This was bad. I talked a lot about Julius already. I talked a little bit about Rudy, but he only played 22 minutes. He had 3 points and 4 rebounds. 2 steals, no blocks. I mentioned the 2 steals already. Missed a pair of free throws in the first half when it was still a close-ish game. Not a good Rudy game. Mike Conley, this was one of those games where you wonder, it kind of felt like when he looked worn out last May. 3 points on 5 shots, was 1 of 3 outside the arc, hit an early 3, which was important. Again, game still in the balance. That was his only bucket of the game. Missed a couple of floaters badly. He just can't make floaters. I'm sure the wrist injury has something to do with it. But every time he shoots a floater last year before after the trade, it was going in every time. I just expected it to go in. Now it's the opposite. Those floaters are not hitting for Mike Conley. We talked about Ant. The line looks okay. The reality was he didn't play hard enough. Naz was not good. The foul trouble was awful early. 1 of 7 shooting for Naz Reid. 1 of 4 outside the arc. 4 fouls and 3 points in 16 minutes. Touched on Dante. Touched on Nickeil. Now we're to garbage time, guys. Rob Dillingham played some rotation minutes in the second quarter and was part of that unit that allowed a 22-4 quick run that then extended into a longer, more extended run. Rob did not play well. He had a bad turnover right when he came on the floor. Missed all 3 of his 3-point attempts. Was a bit, he is frenetic. That's the way he plays, and that can be a good thing if it's bottled correctly. He did not play well in this game, did not afford himself well in those rotation minutes that he was given by Chris Finch early. The rest of the guys in garbage time, Terrence Shannon had a nice move and had a bucket. Garza Garza's played a lot better. He only had 2 rebounds in 11 minutes, and he missed a couple of bunnies, or 1 bunny, I guess, near the rim. Minot, we talked about, played well. This was one of those games. Go back to where we started the show. The vibes are off. It's not good. You get Golden State on Saturday. Golden State got beat on Thursday night by Memphis by 51 points. 51 points. And Jack said last night on the postcast, Draymond Green set a record since they've started tracking this for the worst plus-minus of all time for someone who's played less than 20 minutes. He was a minus 42 in this game, which is insane. The Grizzlies, the Warriors' 51-point loss to the Grizzlies is the largest loss, the largest margin of defeat in the NBA this season. So, wounded Warriors that are embarrassed on Thursday night are going to come to Minnesota, where the Wolves were embarrassed on Thursday night. Normally, I would say that the home team has an advantage in a game like this. They don't have to travel, whatever. However, Target Center has been turning on the Wolves quickly this season, and they've been turning on Julius Randle specifically very quickly this season. So, things could get dicey if the Wolves don't jump out to a good start, and that's going to be imperative in this game against Golden State. Whoever jumps out and plays well early could have a chance to bury a team, the opponent, if they're not feeling it on this night. If they go right back into what happened on Thursday for both the Wolves and the Warriors. This is, of course, a matchup that should be good for the Wolves. They played really well a couple of weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago today in Golden State. And then Golden State made the adjustment, played small, played Draymond at the 5. And, that worked when they beat the Wolves, the second game in Golden State. The Warriors also made the move to get Dennis Schroeder. So should be on the floor for the Warriors on Saturday as well. So a bit of a different team, but not a bad matchup for Minnesota. It's always fun when Steph comes to town, and hopefully the Wolves can kind of turn around these the downtrodden holiday vibes into something a bit more cheery on Saturday night. Well, the live postcast, I believe Luke Inman will be hosting with our guy Jack Borman on Saturday night. That'll be live on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. Then I'll be back on Monday, Christmas Eve, if you will. We'll talk about the Warriors game Saturday. We'll get you ready for let me think. The Wolves play Saturday. Actually, do play Monday night. So we'll talk about Saturday's game. We'll also get you ready for their game Monday night. I believe it's Atlanta on Monday. And then, of course, Tuesday on Christmas Eve, we'll get you ready for that'll be the post-game pod for Monday's game. We'll get you ready for Christmas Day against the Mavs. We will have a pod, each of those days next week throughout the Christmas week. So be sure you're following and subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, you could also subscribe to the newsletter, the daily newsletter at lockedondaily.com. And we'll send you an email newsletter Monday through Friday every day, some cliff notes on what the show's about on each day, plus some additional national articles and news and other Wolves news too. So be sure to subscribe at lockedondaily.com. Of course, you can listen to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can follow on X as well. And again, please subscribe to the newsletter at lockedondaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.